This video goes out to all those guys who felt emasculated by their ex-wife, to those who lost their balls and are either still looking for them or got them back. Never again to let them go. So let's start revving that engine. If I were to go back to 1960s America and ask the guy to define masculinity, they wouldn't understand the question. They'd just look at me strangely and say, "What do you mean? It's a guy. He's masculine, plain and simple. That's unless he's a switch hitter." These things taste like shit. The question back then just didn't exist. Back then, men were men. They didn't cry. Just pause for a second and think. How many times we remember seeing our father cry, if at all? Or if we went back in time and told a guy in the 1960s that we trim our balls, they'd call you a pansy and ridicule you out of the bar. Back then, men were macho, but in today's world, the word macho draws so much negative connotation of sexism and alerts to the Me Too movement that they need to put you in check. In this millennial, masculinity has either gotten a bad rap and gets confused with machismo, or we as men just lost touch on how much it's evolved. Even when I did a video on stoicism, a few people recommended that I cover my ass and say the following. Before I continue, let me say that stoicism is not. It is not about toxic masculinity or machismo. Now, I'm sure I'll get a few guys saying that they don't like labels, but labels, it's part of our vocabulary. It's descriptive, it's response-evoking, and it brings us together as brotherhood. Gender roles, they have changed, and asking someone to define masculinity today is a real, genuine question. But the answer is not quite so simple. Masculinity is a lot of things to different people. But one thing is clear, it's evolved. So what happened? We can point out many fingers and guilty parties, but many historians agreed that Manhood happened. In 1960, the first birth control pill, Manhood, was introduced to the States. It was so controversial that studies couldn't even be done here in the States, but in Puerto Rico. And as physicians, typically being male, of course, they used their moral digression if they wanted to prescribe it or not. If you weren't married, many would say stuff like, "If I find out that you're abusing it, I won't refill it." But those are probably the ones that need it the most. Despite the controversy, the sexual revolution, it began. Back then, condoms, they weren't used. It was stigmatized to use them. And if I were to go back in 1960s America and put one on prior to sex, the girl, she wouldn't think that I was practicing safe sex. She'd get scared and wonder if I was trying to avoid giving her the clap or gonorrhea. Buying condoms in 1960s, well, they weren't only hard to find, but they were shameful to buy. More shameful than buying cigarettes in today's world. The irony here is that while the pill helped us bust a nut, we were slowly losing our balls in the process. The pill gave way to lowering the pressures of getting married and having multiple sex partners in a lifetime. It now became more accepted. A Gallup poll taken in 1970 said that 75% of Americans did not care if they married a virgin. And people, they just waited longer to tie in the knot. Take a look at this chart of the US birth rates from 1950, the boomers, then the sharp drop in 1960 was the invention of the pill. That's where my Generation X, right there, started. Badasses that are a rare breed only to be forgotten because the pill. That's because in 1950s, the average guy, they married at 23. But compare that to 2020 when the average guy, they get married at nearly 30 years of age. Then, in the latter part of the 20th century, our economy in the United States, it started changing from a manufacturing economy to a more service-based economy like finances, health, and IT. This change, plus the waiting to get married and pregnant along with the booming economy, it gave women further opportunity to enter the workforce. In 1967, 50% of women were stay-at-home moms, but by the year 2000, those numbers, they dropped to 23%. Women were now taking care of the home and the finances, empowering them to challenge the male role of masculinity. With their sexual and economic independence, women, they started demanding that the husband, that they pony up in the housework, that they become more self-sufficient, including being able to care for themselves. Back then, our views of masculinity were defined by courage, inner direction, mastery, technical skills, and toughness. But not once were they ever defined on being able to care for oneself, like cooking, personal hygiene, if you were a present father, or even how to serve yourself a plate of food. As a divorce and recovery coach, I have this badass Facebook group for divorced men. In this non-scientific poll I did in the group, I asked the question, how many of you remember your grandmother serving your grandfather their meals on a regular basis? In it, 94% of men said that they remember their grandmothers serving their grandfathers on a regular basis. It was, I suppose, just not manly to serve oneself food and seen as a sign of respect for the man to be served. So I'm curious, how many of you have had your grandmothers serve your grandfathers? By the way, if you wish to join our confidential, free, and fastest growing divorced men's group, the link is in the comment section underneath. Just make sure that you answer the 3 questions to ensure that we don't get some bad actors in the group like your ex posing to be someone else. If they did that, it wouldn't be admissible in court, by the way. Let's face it, many of us, we got our asses kicked by our ex telling us to be a man when they really say, honey, make sure you leave the toilet seat down, and while you're at it, why don't you squat on the seat while you piss? I'm speaking metaphorically, of course, but our roles, they've changed, fellas. And many of us, well, after our ass kicking, we look to books and ask why. There are many prominent authors out there and that are major contributors to the Red Pill movement. But the problem with the Red Pill movement is that one of their core messages is men's belief that women by nature are hypergamous and that they only bang guys with money. This is probably true if you're looking for something superficial, a candy girl. But then that's to your fault, because if that's the case, we too are looking for something superficial, something without substance. To my point earlier about women in the workforce, I've seen plenty of boardrooms where the majority of the leadership are women. The girl I'm dating now, she makes 3 times what I make. She's got a certified Picasso at her house. A Picasso. So to me, that whole hypergamous frame of thought it's defeatist, it's lazy thinking, and just an excuse. The Red Pill, it's good for awareness and finding the problem in today's society, but accountability is lacking. Men argue that 80% of the girls, that they sleep with 20% of the guys, and data does agree with this argument, but that doesn't break down the why this happens. It doesn't take into account that for the substance that a man may bring to the table, or how often the man is willing to get out of his comfort zone and try and try and try and try again until he gets it right. It doesn't account to all of that. It just says 80-20. Women leave men now because, for the most part, the female, they've evolved and they've become self-sufficient. When they've had enough, they have an easier time letting go, because men, we may be referred to as dogs, as players, and the forever search for the nappy dugout, when in truth, we're loyal to a fault, because there's masculinity in loyalty. For instance, men are much more willing to die for a cause or country than our opposing gender. Today, masculinity is defined by self-sufficiency, ability to love, be vulnerable, and even how to dress yourself. In a poll I did with the same group, 73% of men felt that being vulnerable is a masculine trait. With the same group though, the top reason why guys don't dress up was because they just don't know how to. Which makes sense, because that's a legacy that many fathers didn't leave their lads. With masculinity comes virtue, self-awareness, how responsible a man is with their children, how much time is spent with them rather than how much time they spend in the office or the size of his wallet. If they have a daughter, to take her to a manicure, and better yet, get one with her. Hint, hint to my fellow fathers and daughters. To teach their son compassion and justice for the weak, rather than to teach them to box. And yeah, that's how they boxed back in the 60s. Masculinity is to cry, yet accept the circumstances that you can't control. Masculinity is confidence in oneself. Post the boomer generation comes my generation, the Gen X generation, also known as the latchkey generation, because many of us had to enter the house alone after school while both of our parents were off working until late in the evening hours. But as the saying goes, if boys don't learn, men won't know, because If the boomers opened the door for women's rights and birth control, Gen X, we started the movement towards a self-sufficient man as being at home alone. We took on the added responsibilities as boys to cook, clean, and do our homework. And a few of us, like me, we even went to sleep without our adult supervision. We opened the doors for cable TV and the 24-hour news cycle as media channels began to emerge and drastically began changing the modern culture. As this technology boomed, the media started controlling the airwaves and speaking objectively, right or wrong. The understatement of the video is that the media leans left in their economic and political affairs, leading to an increase in acceptance of social issues like the LGBTQ movement, drastically changing gender expression, thereby further complicating the question of what masculinity really is. I mean, can a guy be gay and be masculine at the same time? U.S. Census states that today, nearly 200,000 men are stay-at-home dads. Is that masculine? I got called out by a family member for having, as he put it, a feminine wallet. This. Really? Feminine? I called him out by saying that Larry, the cable guy, he shouldn't be giving me fashion tips. It's clear that men's definition and role, that it's changed, and masculinity as we knew it has evolved. There was a time when men, we knew our value and our role was clear. Men contributed by being the breadwinner and the wife was the nurturer. Now, we need to reassess who we are, what defines us, what makes us a man. But not by bitching, but instead by rejoicing, because this is our time. It's our time to redefine our role, to take up the call of duty. And for me, my personal compass when it comes to masculinity is, how do I want my two boys to become when they are men? After all, if you have boys, remember that the ultimate goal is to build men. What kind of man do you want them to be? As you answer those questions and envision it, that defines your masculinity. Thank you very much. And to let them go. Fuck, I can't do that. As a divorce coach, as a divorce and recovery coach, I hear it all the time. How men, well, many